The most horrible punishments ever inflicted. In the long course of history, human beings have devised several tortures and punishments, ranging from simple detention in jail terms to barbaric acts like burning, stoning, and hanging. These may sound dreadful, but various oppressors have come up with even more terrible and twisted ways to punish alleged wrongdoers. Those punishments were so frightening that even knowing them can shiver our spine. These tortures were used to coerce confessions or instill fear and terror among the masses or adversaries so as to prolong their rule. The list of such punishments is quite long, but we will confine ourselves to just a few, which are very horrible, to give an idea of how certain people with disturbed minds used such methods to subdue others. The reputation and terrifying legacy of such methods of torture and punishment remind us today of the depths of human cruelty and the inventiveness of torture techniques. Let us know these horrible punishments. The Brazen Bull. The first such punishment's name is the Brazen Bull. This terrifying torture device was invented in ancient Greece by a brass craftsman, Perillos of Athens, in the 6th century BC. It was first used by the Sicilian tyrant Phalaris of Acragas, who ruled from 570 to 554 BC, to create a terrifying tool of execution that terrorized people who disagreed with the tyrant's reign. The torture contraption was a life-size bronze statue of a bull with an entrance on one side. This door was used to place the victim inside the bull before it was sealed shut. Under the bull, a fire was ignited, which slowly heated the metal until it was red hot. In the brazen bull, the victim endured unbearable anguish as the temperature inside the bull's cavity increased. The bull's head was crafted in such a way that the victim's screams could be heard as ominous, frightening bellowing noises that mimicked a real bull's cry. This ghoulish component increased the psychological terror that was imposed on the victim and witnesses. For the victim, the cramped area transformed into a horrible chamber of excruciating pain as the bronze heated. His flesh sizzled when it came into contact with the searing metal, causing severe burns. A delayed and excruciating death resulted from the combination of intense heat and inadequate ventilation. The brazen bull was one of the most brutal forms of torture in history because of the severity of the agony and the psychological anguish of slowly roasting alive. This brazen bull was not limited to ancient Greece only, where it had originated. During the reign of the Roman Emperor Nero, the same apparatus was employed to put several people to death. Scaphism. Scaphism, also known as the boats, is reported by Plutarch in his Life of Artaxerxes as an ancient Persian method of execution. Scaphism was one of the worst and most painful, skin-crawling methods of torture. In this form of execution, the accused was trapped between two small boats, one inverted on top of the other, with limbs and head sticking out, or in a hollowed-out tree trunk, and force-fed milk and honey that caused horrible diarrhea that stayed within the wooden enclosure. The unlucky person was then drenched with a mixture of milk and honey, pouring it not only into his mouth but all over his face. His face was kept continually turned towards the sun. Soon, the face of the victim used to be completely covered up and hidden by the multitude of flies that quickly settled on it. The condemned person was left out in the sun or near still water. Soon creeping things and vermin appeared due to the corruption and rottenness of the excrement, honey, and entered into the bowels of the victim, and in this way, his body was consumed. When the man was manifestly dead, the uppermost boat was taken off, and it was seen that his flesh was devoured, and swarms of such noisome creatures were preying upon him. The person would inevitably die either of dehydration, exposure, or bite and sting wounds. Blood eagle. The blood eagle might be the worst torture method in the history of mankind. It was devised by Vikings. This punishment was given to those who had either committed the most horrible crimes or were enemies of the Viking society. This punishment was an inhuman and gruesome show of power and vengeance. The blood eagle was a graphic and disturbing procedure. The victim was placed in a prone position, which means his back was up. It was sliced open along the vertebrae while he was tied and lying face down. The executioner used to sever his ribs from the spine with a sharp tool, and pulled the victim's lungs through the wounds, forming an outline that looked like an eagle's spread wings. The victim would die as a result of this agonizing and drawn-out procedure, typically from a combination of organ damage, shock, and blood loss. It was practiced during the Viking Age, which spanned from the late 8th to the early 11th century. In modern times, the blood eagle is seen with dread and condemnation. The Iron Maiden. The next such horrific torture device is known by the name the Iron Maiden. It first appeared in Europe during the Middle Ages, and it became well known in the late 18th century as an instrument of terror and torture. Authorities mostly employed this evil invention to force confessions, punish the accused, and strike fear in the minds of potential offenders. The Iron Maiden looked like a towering, vertical cabinet or tomb with a hinged front and spike-covered interior, sufficiently tall to enclose a human being. Once inside, the subject was confined to an upright position with as little movement as possible because of carefully fitted restraints. Once the Iron Maiden's door was closed, its spikes used to pierce the victim's flesh, leaving them with severe pain and serious puncture wounds. The spikes were placed inside the cabinet deliberately in a way to prolong the victim's anguish rather than inflict instant death. The spikes caused excruciating pain and agony as they gradually penetrated the body. The spikes held the victim's weight and prevented them from moving, getting deeper as time went on. The Iron Maiden was one of the most physically and mentally agonizing forms of torture in history, made much worse by the psychological pain of knowing their approaching death. The Spartan tyrant Nabis used a similar device around 200 BC for extortion and murder. The Abbasid vizier Ibn al-Ziyad is said to have created a wooden oven-like chest that had iron spikes for torture, which would ironically be used during his own imprisonment and execution in 847 Christian era. The Judas cradle. Another horrible tool for torture is known as the Judas cradle. It was named after Judas Iscariot, who was the disciple of Jesus Christ and betrayed him. The torture device was named after Judas as a means of punishing those who were deemed to have betrayed their fellow men. It was used as a means of punishment and coercion to extract confessions. The victims of the Judas cradle were forced into an uncomfortable and dangerous position. Usually, a pointed, pyramid-shaped wooden or metal contraption with its tip pointed towards their genitals or anus was hung above them. Often with their hands and feet bound, the victim was gently lowered onto the pyramid's pointy tip. It caused unbearable pain and discomfort to the victim. As the weight of the body bore down on the sharp point, it caused deep penetration and injuries. Any movement or struggle would only make the victim's condition worse. The Judas cradle's design ensured prolonged torment, as the victim's body weight and fatigue intensified the pain. This device was especially used to exact confessions from people charged with skepticism and witchcraft during the Spanish Inquisition, as well as political adversaries. It was used as a kind of public punishment in medieval Europe, acting as a public show to discourage others from committing the same crimes. It inflicted such pain on the victim that they frequently confessed to crimes they may not have committed, just to end the constant suffering. The breaking wheel. The breaking wheel, also known as the execution wheel, or the St. Catherine's wheel, was a cruel and lethal tool used for public execution primarily in Europe from antiquity through the Middle Ages up to the 19th century by breaking the bones of a criminal or bludgeoning them to death. It was called St. Catherine's wheel as St. Catherine of Alexandria was sentenced to be executed on one of such wheel for refusing to renounce her Christian belief. Those convicted of reprehensible crimes such as murder, rape, treason, robbery, and blasphemy were executed by the wheel. The breaking wheel was typically a large wooden spoked wheel, sometimes purposely modified with a rectangular iron thrust attached and extending blade-like from part of the rim. The primary goal of the first act was the agonizing mutilation of the body, not death. The victim was taken to a public scaffold site and usually fastened to a big wooden wheel or cartwheel. They were paralyzed, their limbs stretched wide and strapped to the spokes of the wheel. After that, the wheel was lifted and placed on a tall pole or frame. The executioner then used heavy wooden or iron rods to strike the victim's limbs repeatedly, breaking bones. He used to start with breaking the leg bones and then worked his way up to the arms. The intention was to cause significant bodily harm rather than instantaneous death. Every blow damaged bones and caused excruciating suffering for the victim. The shattered and bruised body was forced to suffer for hours or days as it was on display on the wheel. In the second act, the body was braided into another wooden spoked wheel, which was possible through the broken limbs, or by being tied to the wheel. The wheel was then erected on a mast or pole, like a crucifixion. After this, the executioner was permitted to decapitate or garrote the convicted, if need be. Alternatively, fire was kindled under the wheel, or the wheeled convict was simply thrown into a fire. Since the body remained on the wheel after execution, later on it was left to scavenging animals, birds, and decay. This form of punishment, like the ancient crucifixion, had a sacral function beyond death. According to the belief at the time, it would hinder the convicted's transition from death to resurrection. The rack. The exact origin of the rack is not known, though some of the earliest examples are from Greece. The Greeks may have first used the rack as a means of torturing slaves and non-citizens, and later in special cases, as in 356 BC, when it was applied to gain a confession from Herostratus, an arsonist who was later executed for burning down the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The rack was in use as recently as the 18th century. It was used mainly to force confessions and punish those who were thought to have committed wrongdoing. The rack was a basic but brutally effective tool. It was made up of a rectangular frame with a set of ropes or chains attached to either end and a roller. The victim's ankles were fastened to one roller, and the wrists were chained to the other. As the interrogation progressed, a handle and ratchet mechanism attached to the top roller were used to gradually retract the chains, slowly increasing the strain on the prisoner's shoulders, hips, knees, and elbows and causing excruciating pain. Using pulleys and levers, this roller could be rotated on its axis, thus straining the ropes until the sufferer's joints were dislocated and eventually separated. Additionally, if muscle fibers were stretched excessively, they used to lose their ability to contract, rendering them ineffective permanently. The torture used to be continued until the victim confessed or died. The rack was used in several important historical events. It was used to obtain confessions of blasphemy accused during the Spanish Inquisition. During Queen Elizabeth I's reign in England, it was used to force confessions from people who were thought to be plotting against the monarchy. The rat torture. Rat torture is the use of rats to torture a victim by encouraging them to attack and eat the victim alive. This is a graphic and terrifying form of torture in which the victim is subjected to agony at the hands of rodents, specifically rats. The Rats' Dungeon, or Dungeon of the Rats, was a feature of the Tower of London in which a cell below the high water mark and totally dark would draw in rats from the River Thames as the tide flowed in. Prisoners would have flesh torn from their arms and legs. It is still used in many areas of the world. Rat torture was used by several South American military dictatorships. It was used in Brazil during the military dictatorship of 1964 to 1985, in Uruguay during the civic military dictatorship of 1973 to 1985, in Chile during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet from 1973 to 1990, in Argentina during the so-called national reorganization process from 1976 to 1983, and in many other countries. It is defined by the introduction of rats into an enclosed area, typically a cage or container, along with the victim, and subjecting them to extreme conditions. The pain caused by the rat torture is severe, both mentally and physically. When rats see the victims up so close, they feel threatened. In their desperation to get away, the mice, driven by their instincts, bite and claw at the victim, creating deep puncture wounds and intense pain. This kind of torture is horrifying because it combines pain, fear, and a sense of helplessness. Boiling. Death by boiling is a method of execution in which a person is killed by being immersed in a boiling liquid. While not as common as other methods of execution, boiling to death has been practiced in many parts of Europe and Asia. Due to the lengthy process, death by boiling is an extremely painful method of execution. Executions of this type were often carried out using a large vessel, such as a cauldron or a sealed kettle filled with a liquid such as water, oil, tar, or tallow, and a hook and pulley system. The victim was stripped naked and then placed in a vat or pot of boiling liquid, usually water, oil, or tar. Or, for a more gruesome experience, the offender could be placed in a cool liquid and then heated to boiling. Records from the reign of Henry VIII show that some people were boiled for up to 2 hours before they finally died. The Ninth Statute passed in 1531 during the 22nd year of the reign of King Henry VIII, that made boiling alive the legal form of capital punishment for murder committed by poisoning, which by the same act was defined as high treason. This punishment originated from a February 1531 incident in which the Bishop of Rochester's cook, Richard Roos, gave poisoned porridge to several people, resulting in 2 deaths. A partial confession was extracted by torturing him and the sentence was imposed on him. His execution took place on 15 April, 1532 at Smithfield by boiling him alive. Ling Chi, or death by 1,000 cuts. Ling Chi, also known as slow slicing or death by 1,000 cuts, was a method of torturous execution practiced in China from around the 10th century until the early 20th century. It was also used in Vietnam and Korea. It was meted out for major offenses such as high treason, mass murder, patricide, matricide, or the murder of one's master or employer. Chinese emperors used it to threaten people and sometimes ordered it for minor offenses. Some emperors meted out this punishment to the family members of their enemies. The condemned person was tied to a post, and bits of skin and limbs were gradually removed one by one using a knife, over an extended period, usually culminating in a final cut to the heart or decapitation of the victim. It was used as early as the 10th century and continued for nearly 1,000 years. Finally, it was banned in 1905. Pena culiae. The punishment of the sack, or pena culiae, was another oddly specific form of execution. It was used in ancient Rome in cases of parricide, or killing one's parents or other close family members. The condemned was sewn into a leather sack with a number of animals, including a dog, a monkey, a snake, and a rooster. Then the whole bag was tossed into a body of water. If the animals didn't kill the alleged murderer, drowning surely would. Chinese water torture. At a cursory glance, Chinese water torture seems to be a harmless kind of torture, but its effect to inflict pain and fear is limitless. Hippolytus de Marsilius, who lived from 1451 to 1529, was an Italian lawyer, and he is credited with the invention of water torture. Having observed how drops of water falling one by one on a stone gradually created a hollow, he applied the method to the human body. He was also the first person to document sleep deprivation as a means of torture, wherein the interrogators would repeat the same questions, shaking the victim at random intervals, pricking him with a sharp pin, or forcing him to march down a hallway endlessly. There is no evidence that the term Chinese water torture has any connection with China. The name was invented merely to grant the method a sense of ominous mystery. In contrast to other forms of physical torture, this device relies on water droplets as a means of pain. Sometimes, the victim is stripped of their clothes, shown to the public, and then tortured. He is typically restrained, lying flat or seated, with his head immobilized. A water-filled container is positioned above the victim's forehead, and a little droplet of water is let to fall onto the same area of the forehead or face regularly. The sufferer experiences anxiety and a sensation of helplessness because of the constant, rhythmic drops of water. The effect of the single droplet increases with time as it keeps hitting the same spot. With the passage of time, the victim feels the impact of water droplets like his forehead is hit by constant hammer blows. The victim can see each drop coming. The victim tries to cope with the monotony, fear, and helplessness, which lead to the gradual degradation of the victim's mental condition, and, after a long duration of time, he is gradually driven frantic to the point of insanity. The Spanish donkey. The Spanish donkey, also known as the donkey's perch or wooden horse, was a bizarre and cruel torture device that originated in medieval and early modern Europe. This painful tool got its name from the shape it resembled, a wooden construction with a thin, triangular saddle that resembled a donkey. The Spanish donkey's victim was forced to balance with their legs on each side of the triangular saddle's pointed edge. The pressure and agony were exacerbated by the fact that their hands were frequently shackled or fastened to weights. The victim's perineum, genitalia, or rectal region experienced excruciating pressure and anguish as their weight rested on the thin edge. The sharpness of the edge, combined with the body's weight, led to excruciating pain and could result in severe injuries. It was used for public punishment and humiliation, or to force confessions. As this contraption was used in public, it was an effective means of establishing control and terror. Crushed by elephant. Execution by elephant, also known by its Indian name Gunga Rao, was a method of capital punishment in India, Sri Lanka, Burma, Malaysia, Thailand, Brunei, and many countries in Europe and Africa. In India, particularly, Asian elephants were used to crush, dismember, or torture captives during public executions. The animals were trained to kill victims immediately or to torture them slowly over a prolonged period of time. Hindu and Muslim rulers in India executed tax evaders, rebels, and enemy soldiers alike under the feet of elephants. The Hindu Manu Smriti, or Laws of Manu, written sometime between 200 BC and 200 AD, prescribed execution by elephants for several offenses. In 1305, the Sultan of Delhi, Alauddin Khilji, turned the deaths of Mongol prisoners into public entertainment by having them crushed by elephants. During the Mughal era in India, from 1526 to 1857, it was a common mode of execution in those days to have the offender trampled underfoot by an elephant. The Mughal ruler Shah Jahan ordered an offending military commander to be carried to the elephant garden, and there he was executed by an elephant, which was reckoned to be a shameful and terrible death. Most commonly employed by royalty, the elephants were used to signify both the ruler's power of life and death over his subjects and his ability to control wild animals. These executions were often held in public as a warning to anyone who might transgress. The use of elephants as executioners continued well into the latter half of the 19th century. White torture. White torture, also called white room torture, is a type of sensory deprivation in which a prisoner is deprived of all color, sound, taste, and smell. His cell contains everything white, including his clothes, walls, floor, ceiling, furniture, utensils, chains, and even food items. Neon tubes are kept on 24 hours a day and are positioned in such a way that no shadow appears, thus excluding the possibility that the prisoner can see a dark shadow. The prisoner is not shown any other color during captivity. The cell is also kept soundproof, void of any sound, voices, or social interaction. Guards also wear all white clothes and speak no word with the prisoner. They wear padded shoes to avoid making any noise. Prisoner cannot hear anything but himself. The victim is fed white food, classically unseasoned rice. Detainees are often held for months, or even years. This type of torture is particularly used in Iran. However, there is also evidence of its use by Venezuelan and United States intelligence services. This torture was documented in the case of Amir Fakhravar, who was arrested in his native Iran and subjected to white torture for some 8 months in 2004. While the physical pain of sensory deprivation is minimal compared to other tortures on this list, the psychological damage is beyond compare. Fakhravar was quoted as saying that when he was released, he was not a normal person anymore, and could no longer remember even the faces of his parents.